Okay, just updating the information as we're getting it in. The winds have increased slightly to 105 miles an hour, but it looks like the pressure has held steady. So, slight increase in the winds. We haven't seen the pressure just bottom out. It's at 976, so that's, one positive there. We're also looking at the forward motion is the same, northwest at 16. That's what we like to see. We want to see this continue to move at a very fast clip. What we've also seen is, and that is not unexpected, is that we have seen a slight shift in the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. And that, as I mentioned, we were kind of analyzing why that might be, though the models really didn't change all that much. The track had been moving more to the north of where the center line from the National Hurricane Center was over the last couple of hours. So it was really kind of a 50-50 shot, as they would indicate either that's just kind of part of the wobble, or maybe they would take that trend over the last few hours and adjust their forecast. And they did. They have adjusted the forecast slightly. Again, we're still looking at a landfall, lower Lafourche, Terrebonne as a Category 4 hurricane, so they have not changed the intensity of winds of 130 miles an hour sometime during the afternoon or early evening. It almost looks like the speed or the timing has sped up a little bit to where by the early afternoon the storm is already making landfall. And as I mentioned, this is why I like showing the center line, because it does now take it once again over Baton Rouge, as opposed to the earlier forecast from 10 a.m. that was just to the west. So yes, a slight shift back to the east, but nothing dramatic. Now that does place parts of New Orleans area. Again, if it kind of makes a landfall like this, you are looking at a Category 4 storm not far south of the city. So we are certainly looking at least 90 to 100 mile an hour sustained winds here in the city as we get toward the early afternoon hours of Sunday, more like the midday and early afternoon hours of Sunday. We're looking at some of the strongest winds. Now, as it continues along this trajectory, those strong winds moving over lower Lafourche and Terrebonne, then northern Lafourche, the river parishes, and then up toward Baton Rouge. So once again, it still looks certain that the worst of this is going to be a little bit more to the south and west of New Orleans, but that does not mean New Orleans isn't going to see hurricane force winds. Far from it. We will likely see winds in excess of 90 to 100 miles per hour, and that is sustained. I'm not talking about wind gusts. Those are the sustained winds. So again, even just a slight shift to the east does kind of matter to how strong the winds will be here in the city. As opposed to, or as far as other areas go, for the North Shore, that does put Tangipahoa Hope Parish a little bit closer to some of those strong winds. Doesn't really change too much for St. Tammany and Washington, and really nothing has changed for the Mississippi coast. It would really have to be a dramatic shift for any of the forecasts that we're anticipating for Mississippi to drastically change. But this is still some very strong winds, and as I said, the wind swath is going to be fairly large at landfall, and then it starts to collapse a bit as it moves inland, and so that may take some of the stronger winds away from our North Shore parishes and kind of confine them to the more western Florida parishes as it moves northward up toward Natchez and then farther north from there. But at the moment, this would place some very strong winds, not the strongest, but very strong winds in the city of New Orleans as we get toward the midday and early afternoon hours tomorrow. So really, from this point at 4 o'clock, less than 24 hours from now, we'll start to see some of the strongest winds associated with Ida moving into the city. So that's just something, again, that slight change means for us. Does that change continue through the overnight and tomorrow? I don't know. Will we see this forecast maintained through the duration? I don't know. There may be another little shift to the west. It may be another shift to the east. That is still very much possible, but certainly something that for folks in and around all of our viewing area, we unfortunately are going to see impacts from. There is no question about that at this point. It's just more of a question of how bad or how severe those impacts will be. As far as the coastline, even a shift one way or another really is not going to change anything for the coast. Inland, again, it doesn't really change much for the bayou parishes, and as you get into the river parishes up toward Baton Rouge. Really, the wild card is just what type of wind speed sustained we would see here in the city of New Orleans and encompassing the entire metro area. So I'm talking about Jefferson onto the West Bank in the city and even parts of the Mandeville up toward Madisonville area. We'll kind of include in all the metro area because conditions are going to be very, very similar right on the North Shore in St. Tammany Parish and even southern Tangi. We might see similar conditions from Hammond to Ponchatoula that we will see here in the city of New Orleans. So when I'm talking about the metro area, a lot of folks assume I'm only talking about the city of New Orleans. No, I'm talking about kind of the entire metropolitan area, and that's what we're looking at this time. As we go into the more mid-morning and afternoon hours, conditions will be probably at their worst over the city and over southeast Louisiana, and then obviously worsening for folks in Baton Rouge and the river parishes as the storm continues moving northward. We didn't really see a dramatic shift in the models. What we saw, and I'm going to actually kind of go backwards here a little bit, what we saw is that the actual center of Ida had been, from the earlier forecast, had been more north of this center line. Well, this will be a satellite image that we will monitor for the next several hours up to the point of the new 10 o'clock advisory tonight. Will the center of the storm continue following along this line? If it does, then I would guess that they would not change the forecast at 10 o'clock. If it's more to the west of this line during the next several hours, then maybe we see another shift to the west. If it's more east, then we might see another shift to the east. Still a lot of unknowns as to the precise landfall and just exactly what impacts we see in New Orleans, but it doesn't change a whole lot.
From WWL-TV, this is continuing coverage of Hurricane Ida.
All right, thanks for joining us. We're continuing to track Hurricane Ida as it turns towards the Louisiana coast. Of course, we're tracking updates from across the region as Hurricane Ida approaches. Devin Bartolotta joining us now with some things that you need to know. Hey, Devin.
All right. Hey, Cherise. I'm Devin Bartolotta with some quick things you might need to know this afternoon. USPS has suspended some services here in Louisiana as we wait for the storm. People in Lafitte, Buras, Grand Isle, Port Sulphur, Barataria, and other far south areas of southeast Louisiana will not get mail until further notice. For a full list of affected zip codes, you can head to the Postal Service website. Tulane Athletics is moving its volleyball and football teams to Tallahassee and Birmingham today in light of the storm. The Saints are also on the move, going to Dallas. The game originally set for today had been canceled. Plaquemines Parish is implementing a curfew tonight from sunset until sunrise until the mandatory evacuation order has been lifted. That order is for the entire east bank of Plaquemines Parish and the west bank from the Highway 23 floodgate in Oakville to Venice. Only outgoing traffic will be permitted after that curfew goes into effect. Remember, you can get more updates along with live interactive radar on our WWL-TV app. Just search WWL-TV in your app store. It is free to download. Cherise.
But here is the very latest on the storm, and something that I want to start with is something we were showing the last several hours is the center of the storm and the forecasted center line from the National Hurricane Center. We talk about the cone of uncertainty. Well, I kind of removed the cone and just want to focus on that center point, which basically is splitting the difference of the entire cone itself. What we had seen since the earlier forecast that came out at 10 a.m. was that in the last several hours, not during the entirety of it, but during the last several hours, the center of the storm had actually been trending more north of that line. So it looked to me that just based on those observations, we would likely see that the storm track would change only based on the fact that the last several hours it was not matching with the forecast. So it's not a big surprise that we, yes, have seen a little bit of a shift, not dramatic, but a little bit of a shift back to the east. However, though not dramatic, a shift one way or another will determine what type of wind speeds we see here in the city of New Orleans come tomorrow midday and through the afternoon. As I mentioned, it does look like some of the strongest winds will begin to arrive less than 24 hours from now. So you don't have a whole lot of time to get things ready at home. When talking about folks leaving, really at this point you should have already gone only because the traffic is so bad. But as you were planning to stay at home now, you need to make sure that everything is secure, brought inside or up against your home to where it doesn't add add to the already flying debris that we know that we're going to see. Winds of 105 miles an hour, so it did intensify a bit from the earlier winds of 100 miles an hour, but thankfully the pressure did not drop. It's still sitting at 976. However, what you also have seen is a very well-defined eye. It has that very more perfect structure of the storm that we knew we were going to see. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another to actually see it. And maybe it's something like this that people need to see to make them aware of the threat. We can talk about it till we're blue in the face of the forecast and the potential and the probability and the maybe of it. And sometimes folks, yeah, but you guys are sometimes wrong. Well, I will say in the last couple of years, the computer models have been far superior than they ever have been in just my history of being a meteorologist, let alone in the history of how computer models have come along since the 70s and 80s. So this is, again, a far more accurate forecast that we present to you now than even what we were doing just 5 years ago. And when the models are all saying this would be a rapidly intensifying storm, you have to treat it as such. And again, as I said, sometimes it's more of a you need to see it to believe it. Well, hopefully you see it and you believe it. This is a monster of a storm, and it is only going to continue to intensify as it moves toward the Louisiana coastline. And based on this trajectory, it does place the center of the storm by 1 o'clock on Sunday with winds of 130 miles an hour, not too far south of the city of New Orleans, and then moving toward the west. Now, obviously, the strongest of the winds are going to be right near the center, but those do spread out in the center, and that would place certainly parts of our metro area maybe on the west bank, and then as you get more to the west of seeing some of the strongest winds associated. We're all going to see heavy rainfall, there's no question about it. We've talked about the surge that is expected. Hopefully everyone that is outside of the hurricane risk reduction system has already left, because we've talked enough about the surge. We know what's coming, and it does look like that forecast is fairly confident, as the confidence level has increased of this becoming a Category 4 right up to the point of landfall. As I mentioned, I like showing the center line because it does give you an idea of how the Hurricane Center is thinking. If you remember the last forecast, the center line was just maybe by about 15, 20 miles or so to the west of Baton Rouge. Now that center line has shifted a little bit more to the east, which places the storm center right over Baton Rouge. And I still think that some of the worst conditions will be seen in Baton Rouge as compared to New Orleans. Still going to be bad in New Orleans, but I think worse in Baton Rouge. Then thankfully by Monday afternoon, the center as it weakens will be headed up toward Jackson, North Mississippi into early Tuesday and out of our area, and moving in such a direction that we'll start to see a wind shift that will help take any of that surge and move it out of our lakes and away from our coastline. There really wasn't, I'll be honest, a dramatic shift in the models, and even though the trend of the storm itself had been a little bit more north or east of that center line, you'll notice when you look at the cone of uncertainty with regards to all of the computer models, the models still tend to go center of the cone to the west. They're not really trending to the east, so they still are going more to the west of the city. It'll really depend upon just how close to the coast or where along the coastline it does make landfall that will determine how close the city of New Orleans actually gets to the center of the storm. Increasing rainfall will begin during the overnight hours, but more so into early tomorrow morning. As the storm nears the coastline, some of the heaviest rain, and at this point, some of the strongest winds associated. As it moves inland, we're looking at the heavy rainfall and strongest winds right near the center. That does mean parts of the metro area, maybe more the river parishes, maybe more Jefferson and the West Bank, looking at some of the strongest winds. But then those strong winds and heavy rainfall continue right over the city of Baton Rouge. By the afternoon hours and through the evening, by early tomorrow or early Monday morning, I should say, forgetting what day of the week it is already, we'll likely still see some of these feeder bands moving over the city, but during the midday and afternoon hours of Monday, notice the heaviest rain and more of those bands now moving more toward Alabama and the Florida beaches, and we should finally start to see some breaks here with the winds diminishing. The models have been in fairly decent agreement, and as I said, Sunday at 11 p.m., the Euro has the storm already inland, coming between kind of Morgan City and Houma, but moving up toward Baton Rouge. The GFS a little bit faster, 11 p.m. on Sunday, the center of the storm is already over Baton Rouge. Now again, at the point it is over Baton Rouge, it is going to be a far weaker storm, but still very damaging winds with the the storm. Winds will be increasing, speaking of which, later tonight, next several hours, those winds will start picking up, likely not in excess of 40 miles an hour, but starting to increase. It was already breezy this morning. The winds will continue to increase through the early morning hours of Sunday. At that point, even early Sunday, you are looking at tropical storm force winds, which can be damaging, but the hurricane force winds are right along the coastline. And it's really at this point that we may start to see, kind of from Sunday afternoon into Sunday evening, some of the strongest of the winds moving into perhaps parts of the metro area. Now, for the city of New Orleans, it may be just off to your west, but for Jefferson, it may be moving right over you, and certainly going to be over the river parishes, and those strong winds continue up toward Baton Rouge. So kind of looking at things the way they stand at the moment, just basing it on the wind forecast of the storm, it may be that really Baton Rouge and New Orleans almost have an equal share of some of the strongest winds. But the fact that the center of the storm, though weakening, will be passing over Baton Rouge, I would assume that we will likely see stronger sustained winds and higher wind gusts.